Hello everyone, welcome to the course Disability Studies in India, Historical, Social and Culture Perspectives. So we have reached to the lecture number 59, which means one more to go after this and then we are done with this course. So obviously I should say very much that I'm thankful for you that keeping it up for this 3-credit course which you are going to get once you clear the exam. And I'm sure that if you have listened to me carefully and followed the lectures, you will be easily clear it. But my job is not just to finish it up as the course it is and done away with the credit and it's over. No. In fact, it's not a purpose of any academic discipline. What is more important is what is takeaway. How are we taking it further? How are we engaging with this? How are we going to do new kind of inquiry in this field? That's very important. That's a very significant concern that we have in disability studies, right? And that is what we are in fact discussing, right? Last lecture, did you notice I was talking about technologies? I was talking about interactions, society and individual interaction. I was also talking about different kind of technology and not limiting to what technology do to our life externally, but also internally, modifying our genes and all that. You get my point? So this is very important concern that we have today. Significant area to focus upon. What are those significant areas we can focus upon? So think about it. All right. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about emerging new research area in disability studies. So look at the slide number 1, right? So the concept of neurodiversity has gained traction in disability studies over the past few years, reshaping how we view neurological conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia. Neurodiversity frames these conditions not as a disorder to be treated or cured, but as natural variation of human cognition and behavior. Research in this area is challenging traditional medical models that pathologize neurodivergent individuals, advocating instead for acceptance, inclusion, and support for different ways of thinking and experiencing the world. Neurodiversity research has implications for education, employment, and social policies, calling for changes to make spaces for more inclusive and supportive of neurodivergent individuals. For example, scholars are examining how schools can adjust teaching methods to accommodate diverse cognitive styles, how workplaces can be made more accessible for neurodivergent employees. This shift toward the recognizing the value of cognitive diversity has profound implications not just for disabled people, but for society as a whole, prompting a reconsideration of the narrow definition of normality and intelligence. Narrow definition of normality and intelligence. Before I go into this discussion more further, in fact, let me talk to you for a second and discuss how we are treating people with cognitive disability. How do we engage with the people of cognitive disability, right? What is their status? In fact, even in this lecture, I did not put a lot of emphasis on neurodiversity. Because see, Physical disability and mental disability, or let's say intellectual disability, they both are very, very different. See, I'm nowhere suggested, not even I'm saying it today, that they are very different from each other. We can draw a line between them. No, we cannot. I'm not saying this. We can never draw a line, because there is a point when they go along with the mental disability, mental and physical both. But at least, obviously, but we cannot say that physical disability is equal to mental disability. This also is not appropriate to say. You are getting my point, what I am saying. So keeping this in the mind, keeping this into the consideration, my question is, why is it so that even today, despite a lot of rights movements, legislation, people with mental disabilities are not easily noticed, available in public spaces? That is the one question. Second question, how people with mental disabilities are represented in our literature, films, or so on and so forth. Third question, what kind of a conversation we emerge when we see people with mental disability or the parents of people with mental disability? Fourth, why is it so that still people with mental disabilities are treated as if they are subject of medical institutions? To a certain extent, that is not the case with physical disability. However, there are cases. But when we compare with mental disability, then I'm talking about these problems, then I'm talking about these concerns, then I'm raising these important questions, which I'm expecting an answer from you, from people with disabilities, from government, from policymakers, academicians, advocates, everyone. Why are we still leaving people with mental disability? Why are we not treating intellectual disability as a form of neurodiversity? What's wrong? Because one thing is, they challenge normative structure to the extent that it feels extremely threatened. Second, the capacity of aesthetics, or let's say put it a different way, the capacity to see and experience the world is so unique and different, which is hard to understand by so-called normal people. Like, how do you look at it? I mean, in fact, there are cases when you don't understand, how do you treat it? Just for example, I'm just telling you. You treat it as insane, right? This is what you say. You treat it as it's not important. It's like it's not working. This very pretty approach tells us our attitudes towards people with mental disability. That's the one. Let's not talk about, because this module is more about research. I'm sure that whoever is attending my lectures, some way or other way they are associated with some institutions. Some way or other way. I'm not saying you are part of institution. You must be knowing some institutions. I have a homework for you. A small homework. Go and research just to find this out. How many people are doing or indulging in research concerning people with mental disabilities? Not disability. Understand this. There's a line I'm drawing. There's a line I'm drawing. The line is people with mental disabilities, not people with physical. That's a question. That's a concern. You will understand what I am asking you actually when you will do this research. And if they are doing it, see the kind of a question they are asking, research questions they are asking. On the name of doing disability studies. All right? Because it will raise a different way to look at the idea of stigma, subjectivity, autonomy, agency, aesthetics. Everything to look at will be altered, transformed if we incorporate this approach of people with mental disabilities. Imagine how do they, like I'm sure, how do they, you have seen many movies, right? Where there are children with disability. What is constantly, what kind of interaction they are indulged in? The interaction is always about a tussle. A person who is resisting, a person who is asking him or her to comply. That is a struggle that goes on, right? And then there is another thing emerges out of this is violence. There is another thing that emerges here is violence. But we are not supposed to leave any scope for the violence when it comes to disability, right? Violence is something that must be abhorred. It should not get immersed. But people with mental disabilities are unfortunately more prone to violence in these normative societies, right? On the name of education, what they have, I don't think so. Any much thing is available. On terms of access, no, it doesn't. Even the very idea of access is something different when it comes to people with mental disabilities. Special education is for whom, mental accessibility is for whom, and what ways accessibility you're talking about, right? I have traveling so far, I have been traveling so often, but I hardly see people with mental disabilities also traveling, right? Hardly, I'm telling you, rarest of the rare. I can tell you number of airports, I can tell you number of railways. I have been witnessing every second months, but it's difficult. Why is it so? This is the question I'm raising. That's the problem I'm posing. Who is going to address these questions? Who is going to talk about these questions? Are you going to do research in this field? Are you going to come up with some new ideas by exploring the concern associated with people with mental disabilities? All right. Look at the next slide. So in the next slide, I'm talking about historically, disability studies has been dominated by Western perspectives. But in recent years, there has been growing recognition for the need to incorporate global and local viewpoints, what people say is glocal, right? Sometimes they say. So disability studies in various regions are advocating for disability studies experience differently across cultures, and the meaning of disability varies depending on historical, social, and political context. New research is expanding the field of incorporating voices from the global south, examining how disability is understood and addressed in different cultural and political settings. For instance, in a country like India, disability is often framed within a spiritual or moral context, where physical and cognitive differences may be linked to karma or divine punishment. We discussed this to the great extent when we are talking about this in some of modules. So in contrast, what we see that Western frameworks emphasize right-based approach to disability, such as those outlined in the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Scholars are increasingly interested in how these different frameworks influence disability policy, activism, and social attitudes. So we have a global perspectives that highlight the disparities in access to healthcare, education, and employment for disabled people, particularly in low income countries, right? How do we do that? So, research is also exploring how disability right movements are emerging in different parts of the world, influenced by local tradition and struggles, right? Disability activists in various regions are advocating for the recognition of disability as a human rights issues, pushing for legal reforms, social exclusion and inclusion, and greater access to services and opportunities. So there is a rise of global disability rights movements, which is an important development in disability studies, which signals a shift toward a more inclusive and equitable futures for people worldwide. There is another emerging area of disability studies is the intersection between disability and environmental studies, all right? This is very important. In fact, one of my research scholars, as I must have told you, that he is also doing research in this field, disability and environmental studies, right? The scholars are exploring how the built environment, urban planning, and environmental policies affect disabled people's access to public spaces and resources. Research in this area is pushing for the redesign of cities and public spaces to be more inclusive for disabled people, advocating for the development of universal design principles that prioritize accessibility for all people, regardless of ability. Do you understand this? Right? So this is the point where we are pushing towards redesign of cities, so that people, we have to, what I'm just simply suggesting is simple, we have to frame a new concept of universal design. Simple. We have to redefine it. The increasing focus on climate change and sustainability is also promoting questions about how environmental changes such as natural disaster or rising sea levels disproportionately affect disabled populations, right? How it affects disabled population. That's the important point I'm making, right? This is important concern that I'm raising. So first is that we can look at the concept of universal design, because when we are talking about universal design, who are these people whom we have in the mind, whom we are taking into the consideration? You're getting my point. So this is important concern. Who are taken into the consideration when we are discussing the idea of universal design? That's a one. Second important concern that I'm raising is about doing research to see that how certain disaster, when it takes place, natural disaster, how does it affect disabled populations? How does it affect? You will say, what kind of question you are asking me? No. Who are saved, who are not saved? Who were relocated? Who got more space to fit into? Who are considered prominent, who are not considered prominent? Why is it so that if there is disabled population who are more severely affected? This will open up a new horizon in terms of disability studies, to explore the area of disability studies, right? So far, I have not seen any work which is concerned about natural disaster and disability studies, or any literature have not been written so far. And in novels has not been explored. Movies are also not much into this, to looking at this, because this will give you a very new way to look at disability. That's a very important area. Talking about sustainability and change, right? Change from which perspective? Sustainability is what? How to talk about sustainability? So you have to keep this in your mind when you are talking about sustainability in disability studies. You got this point? All right. So look at the next slide, please. So the next slide, I'm talking about new research in disability studies reflect a broadening of perspectives and methodologies from the integration of intersectionalities to the critical examination of technological advancement. It recognizes that disability is not an isolated medical condition, but a complex interaction between individual and the societies in which they live. So we have emerging areas of research such as neurodiversity, the global disability movement, and the relationship between disability and environment, promise to reshape the way we think about disability, inclusion, and social justice. So when we see these new directions continue to develop, right, disability studies will undoubtedly contribute to a more inclusive, equitable, and just society for all individuals, regardless of their ability. You understand this point? Right? So, to talk about inclusive structure, which encompasses every individuals, which thinks about everyone who can be considered normal citizens despite of their body marked with differences. Their consideration is important. Their value is important. They must be incorporated in the larger structure of the societies, right? So then we have to think about also that mental disabled people are also very different people. They're also diverse people. They are not supposed to limit them, all right? Limitation would not be justified. Considering them as they are different, they are as if diversity, mental with disability people will also be considered as a form of a diversity. Universal design has to be reconsidered, has to be rethought when we are talking about people with disability in area of disability studies. Interaction, I was talking about, that it's also a very significant. As I was talking about that, when we see people with mental disabilities, we hardly find their interactions. We rarely see their interactions. And when we don't see their interaction, it becomes difficult for us to talk about, to discuss, to think. Are you getting my point? So this is why we have to reshape, reimagine, rethink about the idea of universal design, about the idea of accessibility, about the idea of autonomy. And this will also redefine the definition of disability. It will give a new way to look at the disability. So these are the emerging areas. These are the new research. People are already doing it. It's not that you will not get enough resources. Don't think about it. There are multiple sites. There are multiple journals. There are many scholars who are working in this field. And you will be guided properly and you can do extensive research in this field. All right. So don't think that you will have a lack of materials. No, but you have to just figure it out, the conceptual and theoretical framework, which will also be helped by people around. There are people who are doing in this field, exploring these new areas and working. All right. It's like I told you, right? One of my students is doing research in environmental studies and disability studies. One of my researchers is doing film studies and disability studies. So there are ways, there are people who are working, so you don't need to be very concerned that, oh, this is new area, what if I'm not able to pull this out? You will be able to pull this up provided you are committed to do research. You have the interest to do the research. That is very important. All right, so we just have one lecture left in this entire course, which is also going to touch upon emerging new trends and practices in the field of disability studies. I hope we will have something more to explore in our last lecture. All right, so with this, I would like to end my lecture here. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you once again. Take care.